Commissioners Christie and Danley, some projects still pending a decision from FERC were filed over 2 years ago with final environmental impact statements already completed. Is it fair to move the goalposts and subject existing project applications to new requirements?
I think it's not only unfair, I think it is economically catastrophic. You're telling the entire private investment community upon whom we rely to pay for this infrastructure that none of the assumptions that they base their investment decisions on, none of the assumptions that the basic economics, the fundamental economics of their projects can be relied upon.
Commissioner Christie?
I think changing the rules in the middle of the game is patently unfair, and I also think as a legal matter it's arbitrary and capricious.
So will these environmental impact reviews statements have to be done again? And what does that mean in terms of timeline and cost? And to the chairman's point, people at some point throwing up their hands and walking away from projects. Mr. Danley, then Mr. Christie.
There's no particular reason why once a NEPA document is completed, it has to be done again, though unfortunately over the last year we've seen that happen in several cases.
Commissioner Christie.
Senator, by the terms of the policy, it does apply to pending applications. So yes, the requirements are applicable to pending applications.
And then what does that mean in terms of costs for consumers? Commissioner Danley, Commissioner Christie.
I think probably the most startling part of these policy statements is that as far as I can tell, none of the cost to consumers as a subject actually factored into the consideration of the issuance of these. There's no discussion in the policy statements about calculations or research as to what it was going to cost consumers, though there are some vague references to greater certainty in the future. Those are all first principles questions, and we did not conduct that analysis before issuing the statements.
Commissioner Christie?
Senator, we're going down the same road Europe went down 10 years ago. We are strangling supply of natural gas, and just like Europe, when you strangle supply, you're going to drive up the price. And Europe right now is suffering through skyrocketing energy prices for gas and in consumers' bills for electricity. And it's just supply and demand. When you strangle supply, the price goes up.
To pick up on your point, Commissioner Christie, look, let's talk about New England. New England lacks pipeline capacity. Not long ago, 10 of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle sent a letter to the administration saying, don't export LNG because we're worried about LNG capacity in America. In my state, we have stranded natural gas. We can't get it to markets because we don't have pipeline capacity. New England may be being the best example of constraints, which is why the senators wrote saying don't export at the very time we should be exporting more to Europe so that they don't have to depend on natural gas from Russia. Talk to me about, and maybe Senator or Commissioner Christie go first if you would, talk to me about New England as an example of constrained capacity because of pipelines.
Well, there is constrained capacity, and ISO New England, which is a system operator in New England, has cited that very constraint due to pipeline constraints for threatening ultimately the reliability of the electric grid. So I think it's a very serious issue. Gas is the major source today of our electric generation in the United States. And if we cut off the supply of gas, obviously that's going to affect electric reliability and it's going to drive prices up.
And it forces us to rely on home heating oil transported by vehicle with poorer environmental standards than using natural gas. Would you agree with that, Commissioner Christie?
Senator, yes, I would, because remember the pipeline, I mentioned this earlier, a pipeline is a transportation service. It doesn't produce gas, it doesn't consume gas. It transports gas. And if you can't transport gas, then obviously it renders it useless. And I think that's the whole point of this national campaign of bringing lawsuits against every single natural gas pipeline, is to cut off the ability to transport gas from the production to the consumption in.
Commissioner Danley, talk about this balancing test. What is the point of this balancing test, and what are the real-world ramifications of it going to be?
So I think as a general premise, and this shows you my judicial minimalist streak, every time you get a multi-factor balancing test that is going to be done on a case-by-case basis by an administrative agency, what you effectively have is the irrigation of power to pick winners and losers at the whim of the decision maker. And that will be the case here. I predict that we are going to see favored parties being given the nod, and those who aren't will have their applications rejected, and the real-world consequences will be supply constraints and rising prices. And I'd like to point one thing out about the LNG export thing you raised earlier, sir. I am very sympathetic to the concerns about rising prices, and of course, when you export, that changes the total supply and demand. If we had a properly functioning economic system and regulatory system, that wouldn't be a problem.
Right.
Because prices would rise, that would incentivize investment in new infrastructure, that would then increase supply, prices would drop again. That cannot happen when you chill investment from the beginning. We will never be able to prove the number of the Section 7 applications that weren't filed, right? This is a hypothetical that we will never know, but it will chill investment, and we have already had submissions in the docket saying just that.
Thank you to both of you. Appreciate it.